for me to introduce Professor Dewey, whom I've known, I think, since the first ELF meeting in Helsinki in 2007, and followed his research in ELF paradigm, and obviously we started to work later on together on similar projects. He is a senior lecturer at King's College London. His research focuses on the globalization of English and the role of English as a lingua franca. He is particularly involved in exploring the impact of ELF on language teacher education and what this means for how we conceptualize language and language knowledge in ELT. He has presented and published widely on this work, and he is co-author of, together with Alessia Kogo, the co-author of Analyzing English as a Lingua Franca, published by Continue, and then co-editor of the book that I just mentioned, which is co-authored with Jennifer Jenkins and Will Baker, Routledge Handbook of English as a Lingua Franca, and at the moment he is the editor of Journal of English as a Lingua Franca. I would like to invite him to deliver his speech.
Thank you very much, Jasmine, for your introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me again to Istanbul and to Boğaziçi. It's good to see so many faces here on Saturday morning. I'm not, this is probably apparent already, given what we've been saying about projects, I'm not a member of the ENRICH project, but the research that I do and my focus on language and language teachers connects very closely with the research that we're doing in the ENRICH project. And quite a lot of what I'm going to say this morning will connect with what they've been saying about the objectives of the ENRICH project. In particular, does the highlighting go? Oh, it does work. In particular, critical reappraisal. A lot of my work involves encouraging teachers to reflect critically on established principles in English language teaching. In this talk, I'm going to be focusing on what I call hyper-corrective practices, which I think is a particularly characteristic approach to language in English language teaching and in applied linguistics more generally. Okay, so I'll start by talking about my aims and focus. Is that, that looks a little bit blurred for me. Is that, can you see that? Is that clear? Can we refocus that? It's quite blurred, isn't it? Okay. So here are my aims. These are my aims and the focus of my research. Okay, so global Englishes and ELF research mean that critical reflection is not only important, it's essential in my view in English language teaching. In particular, it's important that we adopt a much more critical stance than we have done in the past on the notion of language and language awareness among language teachers. I'm especially interested in, or have become especially interested in the past year or so, the concept of emergent language. Is that a concept you're familiar with? What does that mean to you, emergent language?
Ever-changing, dynamic.
Right, that's exactly how I think of emergent language. Ever-changing and dynamic. Unfortunately, and very disappointingly, in English language teaching, in pedagogic materials and teaching manuals, that's not how emergent language is defined. So, I came across this term in the past year or so, first from a PhD application that was sent to me by someone wanting to do a PhD at King's College London. And he used the term emergent language, and I thought, great, this is exactly the kind of thing I'm interested in. And as I read more of his research proposal, I became a little bit more disappointed. Right, so basically in English language teaching discourse, emergent language is a term used to describe what students do in the classroom, which is unplanned. Yep, so it's language that it's student or learner output that the teacher hasn't prepared for, that's spontaneous. Okay? And from a very conventional, prescriptive perspective, contains errors. And the focus of the interest in ELT is predominantly on the errors. So there's little, so far, there's been little reference to emergent language in language teacher education. Language awareness, where it is dealt with in language teacher education, is probably predominantly undertaken from a deficit perspective, with a focus, a very strong focus on learners' apparent linguistic problems or language gaps, which a teacher perceives during that unplanned or spontaneous output. Okay, by contrast, a lot of very communicatively valuable language use, which is emergent, is being overlooked in the classroom. So from an ELF perspective, the current approach to the concept of emergent language in language teaching is hugely problematic, and to me it makes no sense. So it's something that this is the point that I really want to take that critical stance on in my talk today. So despite a growing awareness, we've talked a lot already about ELF awareness, at some point in the discussion in the questions later on, maybe my take on the concept of awareness and how that maybe is different from the concept in the project. That might become a part of the discussion later, I don't know. So despite growing awareness, approaches to language awareness and language knowledge still are strongly influenced by what I call this hyper-corrective behaviour in response to language. There's a disproportionate preoccupation with form and prestige language norms, regardless of whether or not they are important for communication. So I think we need to re-examine the concept of emergent language from an ELF perspective, and I think we need to look at linguistic problems and language gaps, not as a consequence of the learners or the speakers of English who are developing the language, but more as a consequence of problems and gaps inherent in English itself. And so that, from my point of view, and from an ELF perspective, the linguistic gaps are not found in the speakers using the language, they're found in the language. And this is why we need emergent language. We need speakers to be creative with the language in order to overcome those linguistic gaps in English. Okay? Right. Does that all make sense? We're getting there, So in order to do this, we need to develop critical thinking in language teacher education as a way of adopting a much more ELF-oriented perspective on language and communication, and that entails re-examining rather long-standing assumptions we make about the role of native speaker English, first as a pedagogic model, and then secondly as a means of determining language competence. So modelling of language in ELT is still predominantly norm-based, and we still continue to identify language competence and proficiency in relation to that normative model. Okay, so how do we need to rethink, well first of all, why do we need to rethink current practice in ELT? The noticing hypothesis, all of this idea about emergent language and the way that's interpreted in English language teaching comes from second language acquisition theory, particularly from the work of Michael Long. He talks about the noticing hypothesis, the idea being that for learners to acquire language, for them to develop a second language, they need to notice, be able to notice and identify the gap between their own output and then a target language norm. Okay? So this is, interestingly, described in the literature in relation to negotiating meaning. Yeah? So Long, in 1996, said that negotiation of meaning directs learners' attention to those linguistic forms they have used incorrectly. So I see a real problem with this. But on the one hand, the claim is that this is important for establishing meaning, or communicating meaning. But on the other, we're concerned with forms that have been used incorrectly. We know from ELF research that a lot of the grammatically inaccurate forms, according to a native speaker model, are communicative. Sometimes they're more communicative. Non-standard forms are sometimes more communicative than standard forms. So this conflation of negotiating meaning with standardized norms and correct use of forms is really problematic. Okay. That's all right. You might think, well, that's okay, fair enough. This is 1996, but then much more recently, Ellis and Shintani in 2014 take exactly the same kind of stance, where they talk about negotiating meaning in relation to errors and correction and language problems. Okay? When learners experience a problem in comprehending something, or when they are unable to clearly say what they want to say. But this is how they define negotiating meaning. It's seen in a problematic light. It's described in relation to the problematic utterance and being able to produce that problematic utterance in a more target-like way. Here they give an example. Right? This is an example of a recast. Right? So a recast is an utterance that reformulates the problematic utterance. So, for example, and this is Anderson Shintani's example. They present this as an example of a teacher recasting what a learner says. So the learner says, "I visit the doctor." The teacher says, "You visited your doctor yesterday." "Yes, yesterday." But the meaning is contained in yesterday, not in visited. Yeah. So there's not been any there's no engagement with meaning at all here. It's only engagement with form. But in the materials, in the discourse, it's described as negotiation of meaning. It's a recast. Right? And then you've also got clarification requests, and there's an example of a clarification request. Same language form being addressed in a different way methodologically. All right? What's also interesting and disappointing and very typical of a lot of second language application is that, of course, this is not classroom discourse. This is not a teacher responding to learner output. This is entirely artificial. It's invented, constructed. And that's also problematic. And this is what Ellis and Shintani say. All right, again, all right, focusing on negative evidence, something that contravenes target language norms, and it's up the focus of what the teacher does with this emergent language is to enable students to notice the gap between the existing language system and the target language system and modify their erroneous output. Okay, so a very, very negative way of looking at student language that's developing or emerging. Okay. Just to illustrate this, the extent to which this approach to language, or orientation to language, is so commonplace in language teaching, I've taken a couple of terms from the TKT glossary of terms. I don't know if you've heard of TKT. The teaching knowledge test. It's a Cambridge assessment test designed to enable teachers to demonstrate their professional knowledge. So it's a modular certification system for teachers where they are able to demonstrate that they've got this certification, that they know about language. And if you look at the glossary of terms, it's fairly indicative of the approach to language that we conventionally take in ELT. For example, the word interfere. People have taken issue in SLA and applied linguistics research with the concept of interference. That's something that people in applied linguistics were taking issue with when I first studied applied linguistics 25 years ago. But it's still there in the glossary. The term interference is still used, a very negative way of thinking about student language and the relationship between L1 and L2. There's the definition for language awareness is a very simplistic definition, and it's focused on the rules of how language works. There's nothing on communication of meaning in the definition of language awareness in the TKT glossary. Okay. The concept of authenticity is defined in relation to a first language speaker. So what's authentic? It only counts as authentic if it's produced by native speakers of the language. So really problematic items present in the glossary. And then definitions that are really reductive in nature. So for example, I mentioned modelling of language at the beginning. Yeah, a model in the glossary of terms is described as a clear example of the target language for learners to repeat. Right? That's to me not especially, not an especially communicative way of thinking about the modelling of language. Right? There is no clear target or target set of forms when we're talking about the use of English for lingua franca communication. We know that. Right? So it's all about targeting specific forms and then drilling learners. That's a really disappointing definition of the model. And then native speaker is also very narrowly defined. Okay. you've got the terms recast and reformulation, which I've already mentioned in relation to the Ellis-Shintani text. And here again, you can see that it's defined in relation to errors and appropriacy, or the concept of appropriacy. And reformulation is when a teacher corrects what a learner has said by repeating the sentence correctly. So there's this really strong focus on what teachers do in response to learner output being defined in relation to a corrective response. Okay? And that's really problematic. What you don't see in the TKT glossary, or in other glossaries that are written for practicing language teachers or novice language teachers wanting to find out more about key terms, what you don't see in any of these is that these really important terms from an ELF perspective especially, there's no entry for accommodation or bilingualism or multilingualism. There's nothing on code switching or translanguaging. Yeah? There's nothing on communicative strategies. The strategies are learner strategies, yeah? Not communicative strategies. And we know from ELF research that communication strategies are really important. There's nothing on culture or on interculturality or transculturality. Negotiating is there, but it's not really about negotiating meaning, it's about focusing on form. Paraphrase and rephrase, the strategies that speakers engage in regularly in ELF communication, yeah, with the concept of repertoire, transfer, translation is not there. So really important. These, for me, I don't know what others in the project feel about this or what you think about this, bearing in mind what we know about English as a lingua franca. For me, all of these items should be there in any glossary of terms when, if we think about language from an ELF perspective in English language teaching. I don't have time to look at this, but I've been collecting examples of video clips where speakers who are, in my view, entirely intelligible have subtitles written, yeah, for the audience. There were a couple of examples recently in the media that were discussed quite widely in the UK. One was an Irish farmer from Northern Ireland who was being interviewed by a BBC reporter, and when the farmer was speaking, okay, he had quite a strong Northern Irish accent, but he was intelligible. The BBC decided that he needed subtitles. Yeah? And I think this is outside of language teaching a much broader indication of how corrective we are in relation to language. He didn't have what the BBC perceived to be the right kind of accent for the audience to understand. Yeah? And what that does is suggest that we're not very good at dealing with linguistic diversity and linguistic difference. Okay? And I think that's another characteristic feature of the way we think about, traditionally, the way we think about language in English language teaching. You'll find lots of examples of these, and not just in English. I found examples of subtitles used in Spanish for speakers of different varieties of Spanish. You'll find quite a lot of this online and a lot of discussion of it online. So really what I want to do is talk now about my research and what I've done to try to engage teachers in critical thinking about these corrective practices. Right? The first one, what I'm going to do is show you some extracts from a focus group interview that I carried out in December 2018 with a colleague working as a teacher trainer in a teacher training college in London. Okay, and what we did, I won't start it yet because you'll start reading it out. So the idea was we wanted to know, or wanted to find out what the teacher educators or the teacher trainers working on pre-service training programs and in-service training programs that led to certification. So the Cambridge Assessment Teaching Awards, the certificate and the diploma teaching awards. We wanted to know what trainers working on those looked at when they were reviewing applications and preparing for an interview. So all of the applicants who come onto these teacher training courses were given an interview to begin with. And part of the interview was to determine what level of language awareness the training teachers had before starting the course. And it was the tutor's responsibility to decide whether or not to offer a place on the course. So it's kind of a gatekeeping exercise. Right? And here they are talking about a language awareness task that one of the course participants had been asked to complete before the interview. And here you've got 4 different teacher educators discussing this candidate's task. The candidate was offered a place on the course, eventually, but here's their discussion. I'll give you some time to read it. To apologise to Lucia because it's an Italian example which you've already seen. It's Franca. This is December. Okay, so MN, that's me. Right. So I was asked. So first of all, I started by asking the participants in the group. So there are four teacher trainers. Me as a researcher and my colleague also as a researcher. And we all 6 of us had experience of being teacher trainers working on these courses. So I was also used to be a tutor on these courses. All right? And so I asked this question, this is my interest here, right, is there anything you want to say about through it is the task. That's the language task or the language awareness task that the training teacher is given before the interview. Is there anything that's worth picking up on here in the task itself? Okay? And then one of the participants says, how do you think he did in terms of his language? There are Italian. So there is one of the tutors described as typical Italian examples of word order. And I didn't know what this meant. I didn't know what was a typical example of Italian word order. Right? And the conversation goes on. Right? You gave him the opportunity to correct. So again, showing that what they're interested in is whether or not the teachers can identify language problems and correct them. Okay? So this corrective orientation to language is really evident in the conversation. I might say I'm rejecting this person. So this was somebody who had been offered a place on the course, but one of the trainers was saying, oh, I might reject this person. Okay? And it was someone who was already an experienced teacher. Right? If there are errors, so my question is this, how important is that? If there are errors, how would you describe that as evidence? Okay? And then we've got the term interference being used into the transfer. And the conversation goes on. Right? So this is the example of the apparent typical Italian word order I'm reading here from the task. I will write on the board the word deletion. And I hadn't seen this as at all interesting. There were lots of examples of this teacher's language awareness that I thought were relevant to pick up on in a discussion that the tutors hadn't looked at. And by contrast, they were picking up on this, what they saw as erroneous word order. There was somehow something problematic with this. And I couldn't see it. It was described as idiomatic, right? And I still said, whereabouts? And then the tutor reads again, okay, and said, then providing the correct, what he sees as the correct form, I would write the word delusion on the board, instead of I would write on the board. So it's a really prescriptive or hyper-corrective way of thinking about language. And this is not a learner, language, this is teacher language. Right? This is a teacher applying for a diploma course in English language teaching. And then the conversation goes on. But there was a lot of concern with mistakes and errors, and not much discussion of what's communicatively effective, what's pragmatically important, and so on. Right? And if you look at the way language awareness is talked about in teacher education literature, it's talked about very much in this way, in relation to correcting target language forms as part of a grammatical system. Right? So language awareness is always, or typically, nearly always described in relation to language as a system. Right? So if you look at, and here I've got a dictionary definition of system. If you look at these definitions, I think that describing language as a system is a really unhelpful metaphor. It's something that is still left over from a very conventional second language acquisition approach approach to language and communication. Language is not, yes, okay, we can describe linguistics in relation to language systems, but that's not a very helpful way for teachers to think about language if the focus of language teaching is developing language skills for communication. Right? A system is something that is a system is something that is closed, self-contained, regulated. It has boundaries and so on. Okay, that's not how I see language from a health perspective. Language is more fluid, it's more dynamic. It's perhaps not appropriate to describe it as a system. You've got evidence of this. I spoke about the importance of awareness of health. That, however, despite growing awareness, and there is a lot of evidence that teachers are becoming much more aware of health, and that health is beginning to appear in the syllabus for teacher training programs. Yeah, the CELTA and Delta, the Cambridge Certificate and Diploma Teaching Awards, now contain reference to global Englishes and health. But when you look at the materials, so this is, I don't know if you know this book, you've probably heard of the author, Scott Thornbury. Right, this is the second edition of a much celebrated book about language designed for language teachers to help them develop better language awareness. It's called About Language. The first edition came out in 1997. It wasn't revised until 2016, but when it was revised, it included a chapter on global Englishes, world Englishes, English as a lingua franca. And interestingly, you can't see that, I know, don't worry, I'll explain what it is. So interestingly, it includes this task. This is an activity, and though the bullet points are lists a list of typical linguistic features that have been identified in health research. Okay? The problem is not the features. The problem is the task. Then here you've got an extract from some health corpus data that I quoted together with Jennifer Jenkins in an article that we wrote. And so Thornbury has taken this extract of health interaction and he's listed some linguistic properties, and then he gives the teachers a task. The task is not look at this interaction and identify ways in which the speakers are communicating in English in an effective way. It's not highlighting what's effective about it. It asks the teachers to underline any non-standard forms and then discuss with your partner whether or not you would correct them. So even though there is ELF data in this teaching guide, and there's a focus on the linguistic properties of ELF, from a teacher perspective, it's only looked at again in relation to this notion of correctiveness, of hyper-corrective behaviour. So this is why we need to think critically. Even when there is a focus on English as a lingua franca in teaching materials, it's done from a very traditional perspective. It's done in an uninformed way. It reinforces the hyper-corrective approach to language rather than critique it. All right, so I'm going to show you some data from a narrative inquiry project that I took part in a couple of years ago. And so just to define it, narrative inquiry is a means of engaging in research with teachers that encourages teachers to produce personal stories as a means of encouraging the teacher, enabling the teacher to re-examine practices, and so therefore the idea is that it will lead to teacher development. And often in the literature you will read about the transformative power of narrative inquiry, of encouraging teachers to engage in autobiographical accounts of their learning and teaching trajectories. Right? So the idea is that it entails teachers becoming compelled to confront how their understanding of teaching came about. It's often described in the literature as a means of re-seeing, so seeing something again in a different light. Okay? Which is why I think it's particularly appropriate from an health perspective, because that requires us to rethink and re-see language and communication and the way we think about language and communication. So the idea is that teachers recognise the consequence of their beliefs, knowledge and experiences, and what and how they teach. Unfortunately, I think for the most part in narrative inquiry in language teacher education, the focus has been on how they teach. Okay, that's really useful, that's really important, but there's been relatively little focus on what it is that teachers teach. And we need to do much more work on the what part of this. And here, referencing so this is a similar project, in fact. So it was a European-wide project with the following partners. So there were partners in France, in Paris, Pavia in Italy, Bacala in Romania, Uppsala in Sweden, in Poland, London, and then in Portugal, in Almada in Portugal, which is near Lisbon. Right? Okay, so these were the 7 partners working on this project. It was funded by EU money, and here is the project rationale. And I think there are interesting overlaps between what we were trying to do in this project and what the ENRICH project is about. Although in this project, the other participants and the other partners in the project were not thinking about ELF because they were thinking about other languages. They were thinking about Polish, French, Portuguese, Italian, not about English. Right, so here's the project rationale. The idea is that contact with second language can be the source of negative emotional, cognitive, and pragmatic experiences. So it was really trying to understand the impact of language content, where that became the source of emotional, cognitive, and pragmatic experience. Yeah? If it occurs in a context of conflict and under asymmetric cultural and social conditions. So it's all about trying to understand the impact of linguistic diversity and pluralism. And here's the project focus. To explore personal language biographies, that was a narrative inquiry project, as a means of promoting self-reflection among learners and language professionals. So some of the project partners looked at learners, some of the project partners looked at teachers. My focus was on teachers. All of my participants were non-native speakers of English who were working as teachers. Okay, at the time of the project, in order to revalue language and dialect and promote greater understanding. So this was key, promoting greater understanding of pluralism. Right? Okay. So some of the research findings were a lot of the teacher biographies referred to discrimination, unequal access to employment opportunities, unfavourable contract terms, and unfavourable working conditions. A lot of the teachers reported having their own claims to professional expertise and language knowledge undermined or actively denied. And I understood a lot of this to have occurred as a result of this very prescriptive orientation to language, that there is one correct way of using language and that we should all strive towards that. Okay? So it's a standard language ideology underpinning the kinds of experiences that the teachers in the study were reporting. I've got 2 case studies to show you. Both of them are from South Asia, both of them from India. So the first case study, Nahi, is from, she describes herself as a Marathi speaker. Marathi is her first language. Marathi is spoken here, this is India. Okay. I learned it as my first language at home. However, I would also say English, as I have been educated in English in school, and I'm more proficient in English than any other language. So she grew up with Marathi at home, but describes herself as English dominant. English is her dominant language, especially in her professional life. She's an experienced teacher at the time of the study, but she also speaks Gujarati, Hindi, and German. She's a qualified teacher. She has the Cambridge certificate and the postgraduate certificate of education with an ESOL specialism from a UK university. And at the time of the study, she had been teaching for 8 years in an ESOL setting in London, largely teaching migrants or refugees and asylum seekers. Okay? And this is some of her responses to a questionnaire that we administered. Okay. So here, we asked participants in the study to comment on what they understood by these terms. Good English, standard English, English as a lingua franca. So we wanted to understand to what extent they were aware of English as a lingua franca and whether or not they could articulate what English as a lingua franca meant. But also, we were interested in their approach to language and language knowledge. We wanted to know what they thought of good English, right? And so these are the responses of this participant, Nahid. Right? So this data here comes from the autobiographical part of the study, where she was asked to give a written narrative account, and then this comes from a questionnaire we later administered, and then there were follow-up interviews as well. Right, so she said this, she described good English as this: English that, despite not being standard, is intelligible. Might have more pragmatic English. So she's got an understanding of what is effective or what is important in language from a pragmatic approach, right? Not from a standard language approach. And she describes standard English in this way. Some learners aspire to achieve this, and some teachers promote it too. So there was a sense here that she felt that there were alternatives to promoting standard English as a classroom model. And then she had a fairly sophisticated understanding of English as a lingua franca, defining it as English is used as a common language between people who do not have a common language other than English. So she was also asked in the questionnaire, one of the participants were asked to talk about their own teaching priorities. They wanted to know about their awareness of language and knowledge about language, but we also wanted to know how this might impact on what they did in the classroom as experienced teachers. And she says, in response to this, thinking about your own teaching context, please state whether you agree or disagree with the following statements. And we had a series of statements, some of which were designed to reflect a fairly normative, traditional approach to language in the classroom, and others that were designed to reflect a more ELF-oriented perspective. Okay, so here you've got the sort of conventional standard English approach, which we describe as ELF-unfriendly classroom perspectives. For example, non-native English-speaking teachers should adopt an English as a native language variety as their target model. She strongly disagreed with that, giving it a score of 0. It is important for learners to use correct language forms, strongly disagree. So these are her responses. Very strong disagreement and disagreement. Right? English language learners prefer to have native English-speaking teachers. And then, by contrast, the ELF-favourable classroom perspectives, for example, that teachers should encourage students to experiment with new language forms, she strongly agreed. Right? So you would think, right, this is a teacher who does have good ELF awareness. She is engaging with the concepts of ELF by adopting a more ELF-oriented approach to language in the classroom, or at least she's doing that when she reports to us what she sees as priorities for language teaching. Okay? But then in interview, she says very different things. So there seems to be quite a conflict in her mind between what's reported here in the questionnaire and then what she says when she's interviewed about her experience of language and her experience of language teaching. So remember that she's described herself as English dominant. English is her dominant language now, despite growing up with Marathi as her mother tongue. And she says this, right? I'm terrible with pronunciation. I hate my pronunciation, the accent that I have. She later, slightly later, when challenged on this, you don't like that, she says she sort of backtracks a little bit and says, well, okay, I know my accent, I don't have anything against it, but I do not teach pronunciation in class, I'm very conscious of it. So she, first of all, says that she hates her own accent. She's very self-deprecating about her own English in relation to using that English as a model for learning in the classroom. And then says that, okay, I don't hate it, but I'm not going to use it in the classroom to teach my students. And then she later talked about how she would use audio recordings to model pronunciation rather than her own speech. Okay? So case study 2 is very different, but also quite similar in many ways. So this is Priya, who identifies as Anglo-Indian. She also was born and grew up in India, in Tamil Nadu, which is in South India. Right? My mother was not Tamil, she was not accepted into her father's family. Okay. English was the only language we spoke at home. I remember my mother hearing my mum speak Tamil to my father and neighbours, but I don't remember speaking Tamil myself. I understood Tamil, but could only utter a few basic words. Right? So she identifies as Anglo-Indian, and English has always been her dominant language. She describes herself as a native speaker of English. Okay. And in the interview she says this. She reports growing up with feelings of discrimination, but then later on, she talks about her experience of coming to the UK and applying to a UK university to study for a master's degree. Here, when she talks about I need to prove that I can speak, she's referring to the fact that the university required her to take the IELTS test to demonstrate her English proficiency. She grew up with English at home. English was always her dominant language. She identifies as Anglo-Indian and as a native speaker of English. Okay? Yet the university said, no, you need to do an English language exam to demonstrate that you've got English language ability. Okay? When students apply to my programs at King's College London and the application comes to me, I'm given a recommendation. So the central admissions unit will make a recommendation to me when I look at an application. And they will often say, this student requires an English language exam to demonstrate English language proficiency. A lot of the time I find myself challenging that and saying, no, they don't. They're from Malaysia, they're from Singapore, they don't need a language exam. Okay? Unfortunately for Priya, the admissions tutor didn't have that kind of attitude, and she had to take the IELTS exam. She had to spend money on doing an IELTS exam to demonstrate that she was proficient in English, even though it was essentially her first language. So she talks about this discrimination, experiencing this discrimination. She talks about experiencing discrimination among her colleagues on the course, right, who were questioning her claim that English is her first language because of her identity, because she was Asian. How can you be a native speaker of English if you're from India? But then, problematically, and this is the similarity with the first case study, she talks about language in the classroom in a very different way. So she identifies very strongly as a native speaker of English, talks about the discrimination she has experienced in relation to that, but then also talks about language like this. RP is there, and what else would you base it when we're teaching that language? So, she says this. She was asked whether she thought we should change the way we model English in the classroom, whether we should not be adopting RP as a model for teaching pronunciation. And she said this. This is how we learn. So even though she's someone who has experienced discrimination, she still continues to practice that same discrimination in relation to language in the classroom. So similarly to the first case study, she's not prepared to, or feels that she's not able to, present her own kind of English as a learning model in English language teaching. So I've got a couple of examples just before I finish of how I try to initiate critical reflection to engage with this kind of thinking, right? To try and really get to the bottom of that kind of thinking and encourage teachers to move beyond it in their practices. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there was an edited book that came out in 1998 called Language Myths, edited by Laurie Bauer and Peter Treadgill, two sociolinguists. And one of the language myths that they address in this book is the meaning of words should not be allowed to change. And I start one of my classes with this language myth, and we talk very openly, very critically about popular beliefs about language. And then I go on to, there's a video clip of a TED talk where someone is talking about this. It's really interesting one. And then I develop, so I take the idea of the language myths that are presented in Bauer and Treadgill, and I sort of update them from an health perspective. And I get the teachers to discuss these ideas. So I say that, right, standard English is more intelligible than non-standard English is, and I present that to the teachers as a myth, that this is not true, there's no basis in fact for this claim. However, it's a claim that we continue to make in English language teaching resources and English language teaching materials and in pedagogic practice in language teacher education. Native speakers provide appropriate language models and so on. Right? And so the idea is, and then I encourage the teachers to come up with their own new language myths based on their renewed understanding of global English as a lingua franca. Here's an example of the kind of conversations that teachers engaged in once they've discussed these ideas. And here you've got teachers reflecting on a non-standard item in the classroom that occurred. Right? The item was a student used the word curiousness, and then the teachers here are saying, well, okay, it's not standard, it's not strictly speaking correct, but how do we respond to that? So they're discussing ways in which they might respond differently than the conventional way of responding when a student produces a non-standard form. Okay. All right, good. So, and that's the conversation continuing. And they're quite interesting and engaging discussion about what's effective, what's standard, what's non-standard, what's the relationship between standard forms and communication and so on. But they see it as a challenge. It's really difficult because, of course, what teaching materials to use? And this is a common issue that comes up. Okay, so very briefly, in summary, the concept of emergent language, I think, is a really valuable one, but the current approach to the idea of emergent language in the classroom needs to be adopted in a much more progressive way. We need a much more informed understanding of emergent language. We need to pay attention to how speakers negotiate meaning by accommodating and collaborating in interaction, not relating negotiation of meaning to form and correction. We need to notice how speakers draw on and prioritise strategies, and we need to do much more to downplay linguistic form. Now we prioritise linguistic form much too much. And what we need to do is notice the language gaps that the use of standard English gives rise to. Not the assumed language gaps that the learners have, rather, what are the language gaps of English? Yeah? And then identify modes of interaction that are effective but non-conforming. Now, look at those, there's a huge amount of corpus data that's available to teachers, and there's a lot of really interesting discussion that can be had, looking at how language is used effectively in interaction. Right? And then we really need to rethink the concept of problems and gaps, and do that from a much more informed approach. Of course, this is all very interesting and all very relevant in theory, but in practice it's really difficult, really challenging. I've been trying to engage in these kinds of discussions with teachers for a number of years now, and I know that teachers find it really challenging. They come to London, they do their master's degree with us, and then they go back to China, a lot of the teachers, or they go back to Brazil, a lot of the teachers, or wherever they come from, and they are faced with a very normative, hyper-corrective approach to language. And they struggle to reintegrate these ideas, these ways of thinking, with existing practices. Okay. Right, so that's done. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Oh, there was a moment. Sorry, thank you.